Breathing is foundational in the great deep wisdom of the body. No one taught us how to breathe. We came in fully loaded. It's actually a misperception that we would need to train ourselves how to breathe. We just need to unlearn and remember. My conscious mind cannot teach me how to breathe. I need to unlearn all of the adaptive patterns that I've built up over time. Once I've unlearned them, there's nothing more to learn. Our breathing rhythm is aligned to basically the experience that we're having in life. And what that means is we need functional breathing. So we need our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles to be able to respond to the external stimulus. And if that's not happening, we're getting stuck.
The intention before the session is important, right? But
yes.
You always have us set in an intention before we actually go and breathe.
If we're going to breathe for an hour and a quarter, we'd like to be focusing on something that we'd like to invite in and not something that we don't want. The double negation's tough in our subconscious mind. So yeah, framing intention is important. What I love about breathwork, it comes back to our earlier comment. I have found beauty in sitting with people in their discomfort.
Welcome back to another episode on the Aaron Darko Show. Today's guest is Mr. Edward Dangerfield from Breathwork Bali. Now, let's talk about breathwork and Edward's story, because we met about a year and a half ago at a mutual friend's dinner. And it was funny because I was thinking about having a breathwork session before we met. And I was thinking, I wonder if there's someone in Bali who can facilitate a breathwork session with me. And then I go to the dinner and I'm sitting next to Mr. Ed, sitting next to you. And then we start talking about your story and you're like, yeah, I do breathwork sessions. I'm like, this is not a coincidence. So then I booked a breathwork session with you, and that was such an amazing experience. And that really opened my eyes to the world of breathwork, because before then I just heard about it from other people, but I didn't really experience the benefits of breathwork and how it could help people and help myself, you know. And my results is that it just helped me feel more. Like I really was not used to feeling that deeply before.
Yes.
And it just accessed this whole new level of feeling. I was like, wow, it kind of felt like how I did when I did ayahuasca.
Yeah.
But just from a breathwork session with you. And I was like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, so then it opened my mind to the possibilities of breathwork and the benefits. And so, that's why I'm really inspired by, you know, what you're doing here in Bali with your breathwork practice. And you've started Breathwork Bali, your own business, and you've built your new sala here. And it's just amazing to see like the growth that can happen from just choosing one thing and just sticking to that, you know? Yeah. So I'm curious, like I've been speaking for a while now. First of all, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the invite, and stoked to connect here and to chat.
Yeah. So can you take us back to like, why breathwork for you? Why is that so important, do you feel? Why are you so passionate about that?
Yeah, thank you. Like there was so much there in those opening comments. Like there was like enough to talk for probably a few days there about like experiences. Yeah, I think just to get really clear, like you said, like I kind of focused on one thing, and that's just like, it's very narrow and very niche what I do. And even in the world of breath work, I work with one specific modality, which is connected breathing with body work. And the reason it's so important for me is literally my first experience with connected breathing. I had such a profound life-changing moment that I knew that this is what I would pursue for the rest of my life. And it was crystal clear. And you kind of mentioned as well in your intro there about like ayahuasca and plant medicines.
Yes.
But my first breathwork experience was so intense and was so profound. And it was literally like perception altering, to the point where I could have been doing plant medicine. I could have been in a very deep substance-induced state. And it was just breath. And after that, I was like, okay, like, what was that? You know, that was just huge inquiry that I couldn't believe that I could elicit that level of chemical response in my bloodstream from just breathing. And that was it. It was like, I came out of that experience and I was like, I'm training in this. That's it. Yeah. And so, I mean, I suppose ultimately, to answer your question, it was just the feeling state in my own body where I was like, there's something here for me and I want to pursue it. I think the deeper piece is I had already studied a lot of trauma understanding and the nervous system and health and functionality. And I already knew, I could kind of witness myself going through the experience, and I knew what was happening. if that makes sense. I knew I was going into basically a fight-flight response, and then knew I was going into a deep rest and relaxation. So whilst I was going through the experience, I could observe myself in it. And because of that, I was like, hang on, like this is how we create neuroplastic change. This is how we get complete on these experiences that we have maybe buffered or haven't fully felt into and released. So for me, I was like, this is probably the answer to healing trauma for me. And I was like, well, if it's the answer to healing trauma for me, it's probably the answer for healing trauma for most people. So that was the first kind of inquiry.
That's fascinating. Because that's the topic that I wanted to touch on, is the link between breathwork and trauma. I guess we could touch on that later, but I just want to, for people listening, like they're looking at you, they're like, all right, this guy's a breathwork guy, he's the breath guy. But what is the primary benefits of doing breathwork for someone who is just going through the daily life, and maybe they've done yoga and they've done some deep breathing, but they don't really understand the benefits?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to just kind of speak to is we're breathing between 23 and 26,000 times a day. And ideally, we'd want our breathing to be very dynamic, i.e. it's changing depending on what we're doing. So I'm sitting here with you, we're in a really nice space. I ought to be quite relaxed. I would hope that my breathing rhythms are long, deep, steady, and fairly relaxed in the tone and quality. Now, if I was, say, like playing paddle with you, or like we were, gonna go to a Muay Thai class, I would need to up my breathing rhythm would need to shift considerably for the output that's required. And so what we want is that our breathing rhythm is aligned to basically the experience that we're having in life. And what that means is we need functional breathing. So we need our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles to be able to respond to the external stimulus. And if that's not happening, we're getting stuck. So we're either breathing too small and too shallow, or we're breathing too big, simply, like very, very simply. And then basically our breathing rhythm isn't responding to life. So what happens is we're either constantly in a stressed breathing state, or we're too relaxed. And we're not able to meet like the demands and stresses of life. So life's really dynamic, and we would like our breathing to be as dynamic. And so we would like our perception in our subconscious to read the signals of life appropriately and then change our breathing rhythm appropriately. So that's kind of the big macro thing. Right. I mean, breathing's going to affect everything. It's going to affect digestion. It's going to affect our hormone balance. It's going to affect ultimately our weight loss. So, most of our weight is going to be regulated by our exhale, by our carbon dioxide emission, our level of clarity and focus in our mind, our level of presence. Those are all going to be affected deeply by our breathing. So yeah, it's spilling over into everything. And I like to think of it as like the foundation. If breathing is faulty or maladaptive, everything else that we build on top of that would be as well. Yeah.
And that's a whole new concept for me, because I come from I started training, at the time recording this 6 years ago.
Yeah.
I started physical training 6 years ago, like consistently. And before that, I didn't know about breathing or anything like that. And even when I started training, when I continued training, I was aware of my breathing during like a squat, like, okay, you breathe, brace, breathe, like that's it. But outside of that, I didn't place any importance on breathing.
Sure. Yeah. It's so overlooked. Like, the kind of analogy is right under our nose. It's right. But it's really like, for me, like culturally, it's overlooked. We gloss over the way that we breathe, and we focus on so many other things. Like we'll focus on training and nutrition above breath. But, for me, the reality is when we're breathing 23 to 26,000 times a day, if we were to make just the tiniest adjustment in the way that we breathe, it would have a huge impact on our life. And the spillover is just enormous. So I think, functional breathing as well is not really taught very well, and it's not really understood. And when I touched into breathing, like I didn't understand how little I knew. And it was almost a bit like, it was a bit awkward. It was like, I've been breathing all of this time, but I have no idea how I do it, So it was a humbling experience to really dive into that and be like, there's a lot for me to learn. And the reality is, bro, it's just like, there's still so much more. Like I've spent like years, close to a decade now, exploring movement and breathing, and I'm barely scratching the surface of the depths that we're going to. And that's with our research team here in Bali. Like we have a neuroscientist on the research team here, and we're starting to get into a deeper understanding of the brain changes and the blood chemical changes that are happening with rhythms of breath. And it's just like I know we've got another like 30 years of decent research ahead of us, which is fun. It's exciting and humbling at the same time.
So you facilitate a lot of workshops here, right? Yeah. You're a trainer, and you also facilitate for the average, like
Yeah.
people like myself.
Yeah.
Right? And so what have you noticed? Because you mentioned something that I actually want to touch on.
Yeah.
Because we did a breathwork session 2 days ago.
Yeah.
At your place at Desa Lima
Yeah.
here in Bali. If anyone wants to come, it's amazing. I recommend it.
Yeah, thank you.
And but first of all, that place is amazing. It's like
Yeah.
that structure that you built there, the bamboo. It's really a cool architectural feat.
Yeah.
And it's just a nice energy to when you're in that space.
Yeah.
It's just automatically I step in there, I'm just calm. Just
Yeah.
the energy there.
It was really fun to design and build it. We made these little models, and then it got scaled up, and then they built this full size breathwork, custom breathwork space, basically. Yeah.
And you're also building one in Uluwatu as well.
Yeah, we got a small shala in Uluwatu. That's more for like our retreats, residential retreats. So either corporate or individuals. And then we've got one in the works for Ubud as well that we're kind of plotting, but that's maybe another 6 months or a year away.
Yeah.
But it could be fun as well. Yeah.
You said something 2 days ago afterwards. You said you get a joy out of, there's something innately human and nice about supporting a human being through their discomfort.
Yeah.
And I found that to be such a perfect way of articulating it, because I feel the same way about my work, what I do, like support my clients and stuff.
Yeah, totally.
So what do you mean by that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. There's, I remember speaking to that. I was coming up in the share afterwards. There's something, I mean, for you with coaching, I think the essence is really the same. It's like we're exploring these fragile or vulnerable parts of ourselves that we might not really be that comfortable touching into. And initially it can be like a cognitive exploration, into like an area of our own humanness. Like Jungian psychology is such that like I'm all things. I'm deadly serious and I'm really funny. It just depends which moment you catch me in. And so the idea of like strength or softness as an example, I think in our culture and society, we have a tendency to praise certain elements of our humanity and to shadow other elements. And ultimately, sometimes in our childhood or through cultural conditioning, we get really good at hiding parts of ourselves and we don't want them to be seen. And so sometimes when we're coaching a client or we're working with breath, we can find, cognitively, we can find a part of someone that they don't really want anyone else to see. Right. And then we start to befriend it. It's kind of like a part of us that was exiled. And it might be that we had to like not show that in a certain time in our life to succeed or receive love or validation. With breathing, it's kind of interesting because sometimes people will avoid a certain breathing rhythm. And that could be power. So people might avoid the breathing rhythm of power, which is likely a really full, big, voluminous inhale. And sometimes people will avoid the breathing rhythm of grief or the breathing rhythm of like powerlessness or collapse. So really what we do as breath workers is we assess breathing and we find out where someone's a bit shadowy. Like what's the breathing rhythm they don't like really going into? Because the breathing rhythm would elicit an emotional response. So, if we think about it, breathing's dynamic. Power is a really comfortable breathing rhythm for a lot of people. CrossFit athletes, type A overachievers, CEOs and execs, they're usually comfortable in power. Where they're not comfortable is collapse. So if I guide them into like softness or collapse or like even like a grief experience by changing or modulating their breathing, they'll back away from it. They'll power up again. And that might be what leads them into continuous cycles of burnout, as an example. So ultimately to guide someone into the shadowy part of themselves and then hold them in that space and allow them to befriend that. There's something incredibly meaningful for me about it because I suppose I'm also doing that in a certain way to myself. I'm allowing that part of them to be present in the space with me, which also means I must be quite comfortable in that myself. Anger and rage is another great example, like guiding people into their anger. I have to be comfortable in my own anger to be able to sit with someone else in their own anger. And sometimes we've got, big, strong men coming in and raging, and to hold someone in that rage, I need to be quite comfortable in that. So there's a certain quality that I'm tested in a variety of different ways through the work. And it brings a lot of meaning. I think there's a rawness and a tenderness that I really admire because it also takes a lot of courage for people to feel that in a really deep, visceral way. Yeah, so I think it's a really deep, powerful connection. And when people are willing to go that deep, that really quite quickly as well, I have like a lot of admiration for that.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking about, has there been any people that you supported who you've seen, because obviously you can tell the patterns of the breath.
Yeah.
So as you're saying power breath, I'm thinking, okay, you know the pattern, what that's like, right? Like a deep inhalation.
Yeah.
But a shallow breath is like, what are these different patterns, right?
Yeah.
So has there been anyone where they've been in resistance to feeling their shadow side, the dark, the emotions they don't want to feel? Have you noticed that in them? And
It's so funny because like, you know, as a school, we kind of, we use the term that like emotions are signals from the body, right? And we tend to avoid like the idea of good or bad. And at the same time, there are certain emotions that for humans are just challenging to feel. Like guilt and shame are really demoralizing and demobilizing. We don't want to feel shame. Shame's like one of the worst. And shame has this association of actually being cast out from the tribe, which would have led to death, like likely, you know, if we go back in evolutionary terms. And guilt's the same. Guilt's a shitty one. Like none of us really like to feel guilty. And it's there for a good reason. It's so that we actually modulate our behavior. Yeah. So I would like us to have, you know, really good relationship to both shame and guilt. And sometimes we find that someone, they will avoid feeling like certain emotional states. And so the thing about breath work in the way that we kind of practice and teach is there's no real need to force anyone into anything. The natural desire of humans and the natural wisdom that's present actually in every client that I've ever worked with is they want to go in and feel it. There's a like a sort of deep courage in every human that wants to go in and re-experience and befriend these emotional states and these breathing rhythms. Because ultimately, whilst it feels kind of like awkward or painful, there is some sort of satisfaction that comes from it as well. And it's this willingness to go in and feel all of the parts of ourselves. And so the way that we kind of teach and practice is we just gently guide people to the edge. And then we give them the opportunity to step in. And it's not like we're pushing or driving or forcing. We're like, hey, this is an opportunity. And if you want to experience it, go for it. And if you don't, well, maybe today's not the day. And so what we do is we just create this kind of space for emergence. And then we see what arises. And we just trust in the deeper wisdom of the client. And in that way, there's no real way of knowing what's going to come up.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right?
I want to speak to that because so on Wednesday, there's a guy next to me. And because I haven't done it for a while, so I stepped into the space and I've done group sessions before with you. And I just, like you said, you never know what's going to happen. Yeah. So I'm there next to this guy, just for people listening, watching. So I'm there next to this guy, and halfway through this breathwork session, he starts like really howling and really experiencing an intense feeling of sadness, I'm imagining, because he was crying hysterically, like a baby would. Yeah. And that kind of just threw me off. It kind of sent me into my head a little bit because I was like, I don't know. I was intellectualizing what he was going through. Yes. Which took me out of my feeling state. Yes. Right at that point. Yeah. And so it was just an interesting thing to observe. Totally. And I just never anticipated that he would be carrying something that would make him feel so much during the breath work. Yeah, it's fascinating, right? There's a few elements that kind of weave together. The first one is sometimes humans have these incomplete reflexes and we're holding them. And sometimes we have an awareness of them, but we're not really sort of 100% sure of the fact that they're present or that we need to even allow them to move. And then sometimes people are actually over-storying the experience of something and there's nothing there. Like they imagine that there's a problem, but really like when we breathe into it, it's all good, right? So there are these two factors. And then the next one is in group sessions, there are these amazing stimulus of other people in the space. In a one-on-one, it's just you and me, right? And we've got a playlist going and maybe I'll give you some verbal cues. But apart from that, you're the only stimulus. And there's a beauty to that. But if you come to a breath circle and there's 12 or 16 people breathing around you and someone's next to you and they're emoting, suddenly it brings up all of these inquiries around, yourself. It could be like, that reminds me of an experience I've had.
It could be, I'm not breathing that deep, or I'm not doing it right, or why am I not emoting that much, or is there anything in me that needs to be expressed?
That was my experience.
Yeah. So we have this sort of element of self-judgment that can start to come alive. And then we just get to look at ourselves in that process of being like, oh, is there something wrong with me because I'm not crying? And of course, there's no right answer to that. I don't know. But it brings in this process of sort of compassionate inquiry, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah. And you told me that every time you go for a session, you'll experience something different.
I think this is one of the wild things about connected breathing is there's such a huge spectrum of experience that we can have. It can be very physical. Yeah. We can have these big emotional releases. We can be cognitively just mostly stuck in the head or pleasantly in the head. I work with, some corporate leaders and creatives. They'll come to me just to get answers. I have one guy who's just like pulls out a pad after a session and sketches a business plan. He's like, I'll be with you in 10 minutes. He's just written the whole thing. And then, I find out months later that they've just executed on that, exactly what he wrote in that session. And part of that is because the left and right brain hemispheres are communicating in a different way when we're in breath, in that way. And then sometimes we have people who have these intense spiritual experiences, which are close to plant medicine, where they're breathing in such a way that the blood chemistry changes and they have a full out-of-body experience, which ultimately is like chemically like interoception and proprioception, noiseception, they're shutting down. So we don't feel ourselves anymore. We don't feel our body. We lose track of time and space. And those are areas of the brain that are shutting down. And we're starting to research how we do that as breath practitioners. And we're starting to get better at actually eliciting those responses. So guiding certain rhythms of breath to then take people into that state where the sense of the physical body dissolves.
That is amazing. Just to put that into context, what you just said there is you could have an out-of-body experience just basically breathing.
Yes.
Just solely from breathing.
Yeah, I mean, of course, not disclosing any names, but in the experience on Wednesday, there was a client who had that, where they had a total experience of their body dissolved and they were now experiencing life as, not in their body. Wow. And through that experience, they had this emergence of a realization that they were more than just the physical form. Now, they might have cognitively known that. We talk about these, ideas of a spirit or a self beyond the physical form. But they actually had a feeling sense of experiencing it. And in that moment, they were like, okay, it was a profound shift for them.
Wow. And is that a regular thing for you? Do you experience that a lot with your clients?
Yeah, it's a common experience, with certain breathing rhythms. And this is where I'm like, this is really weird and out there. And I'm quite analytical and scientific. So it really conflicts with my natural way of thinking. And as I've gone into those experiences as well, I've been like, okay, what's going on in the brain here? And that's where we've started to explore more. What are the rhythms of breath, the changes in blood chemistry, and then the subsequent areas of the brain that are opening and closing to create the shutdown of interoception, ultimately my capacity to feel myself. And when that closes down, how is it that I'm then still present? So we're entering into almost a dream state, but not quite. It's very lucid and it's very bizarre. Yeah, and it's common. And I want to get better at being able to elicit that consistently. Because when people go into that experience, what we find is there's an understanding that the life is greater than just this meat suit and, what I'm having for breakfast and, how I move. There's this kind of this deeper meaning that comes alive. So yeah, the spiritual experience, we work with questionnaires sometimes with our clients, and we use a variety of questionnaires, and we find that spiritual experience sits between around 70 to 90% of people's experience, somewhere in there. And we'd like to increase the data samples to be able to concretely say how many people actually have what they term a spiritual experience through breathwork. Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating to me. Super fascinating. So people listening, they have a lot of people, as you know, have tried Wim Hof method of breathing. Yeah. And if they're super green to breathwork, they're like, oh, that's breathwork. Yeah. So what's the difference, I guess, between actual your type of breathwork that you practice and something like Wim Hof?
Sure. I'm getting a little bit more outspoken and opinionated on this as time goes on. I've been kind of quiet about it, but like for me, like Wim Hof is a one size fits no one approach. And so the challenge that we face is it's in the field of breathwork, which is kind of a prescriptive way. And a prescriptive way is that you define how you breathe and when you breathe. So we use the mind, the cognitive mind, to control breath. And the most simple form of this would be box breathing. We inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, right? So that's a prescription of breath. I'm defining the inhale, the pause at the top, the exhale, and the hold at the bottom. And I'm saying I'm going to do each one for 4 seconds. And ultimately, I'm creating balance. Inhale and hold is activating, exhale and hold is relaxing. I could do it for 4 seconds, I could do it for 6 seconds, I could do it for 8 seconds. I could test myself. And what I'm doing is I'm using my mind to control my body. And that can be really effective to create awareness of breath and stability. Now that's about it. Like when we start to modulate certain breathing techniques, we start to basically create stress. And what we're doing is we're stressing the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, and we're exploring the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. How do we activate and how do we relax? Now, when I say it's a one size fits no one, the nervous system is so subtle and unique. And it's dynamic and changing based on stimulus. And so if I do Wim Hof in the morning, it'll be different than lunchtime and different than the evening. It's different based on my cortisol levels, which is going to change throughout the day, likely high in the morning, less at lunchtime and less in the evening. It's going to change depending on what I've eaten. So if I've eaten something that I have a slight allergic reaction to, my breathing is the first thing that regulates my pH. So it's going to change my alkalinity and acidity depending on what I've eaten. So if I'm eating foods that have, a fairly high allergenic load, my breathing's going to compensate. It's the first thing that's going to compensate to change pH. So then if I load, Wim Hof into that, that's going to change things again. So it's a very prescriptive way, and it's a very top-down cognitive way of changing breathing. So that's very different than connected breathing, which all we do is loop breath. And if we loop breath, we just remove the top and the bottom pauses.
Could you give an example of that for people?
Yeah, so instead of the inhale, pause, exhale, pause, we're taking the pause away. So we're just looping the breath to the inhale, to the exhale. So it's just like but we're not in any way saying whether it's going to be big or small in the volume or in the speed or in its stability. So we're sort of not defining that. We're allowing the nervous system to define the breathing rhythm itself. And then what we're doing is we're watching the client and seeing how they respond. So essentially we're giving this opportunity for the breath to move how it wants to. And we're not saying breathe like this. We're just allowing dynamism. And then in the dynamism, what happens is all of these different rhythms start to emerge. And then people start to explore breathing rhythms that they might not have touched into before. So this is where like the breathing rhythm of anger might emerge, or the breathing rhythm of grief might emerge. And so then as a practitioner, what we're looking to do is to see whether we need to ultimately stabilize the client or continue to guide them through the experience. And so with the way that we teach in practice, every time as a facilitator we're observing breath, we're looking at this loop of breath, and we're seeing, does it need to be contained and stabilized? So is the emotion and the undertone of the nervous system getting wobbly, or is it just trucking along steady, and do we want to open someone into something? So if I may speak to your breathing rhythm, super steady. I mean, you just truck along, right? And you're just there, right?
Yeah.
So what I want to do is ensure that you're feeling yourself, which is where we use gentle touch work. But then what I want to do is be like, what would happen if I expanded your volume a bit? Then what do? Do you shut down again, or are you capable of staying with this bigger volume? So this is where, as a practitioner, I'm reading you specifically. Now, let's give you the example of the guy next to you on Wednesday night. Now, his breath was moving voluminously, and there was a lot of emotion. So I didn't want to open his breath into anything more. I didn't want him to experience more or bigger rhythms. I wanted to find some stability and containment for him. Now, the two of you lying next to each other, if I facilitated you the same, I would do neither of you any service. For you, I needed to create a little bit more opening with touch work and awareness. And for him, it was more about stability, containment, and support. So even though you were in exactly the same experience of the space, your personal experiences were wildly different. And what was amazing was for the two of you to actually kind of feed and support each other in different ways. You with the steadiness and him with the emotional response. And this is what's beautiful about the group setting is there's always this kind of mystery of like, how is it that you guys are next to each other and learning from each other and giving each other like support in different ways?
Yeah, that was fascinating to me how he was, I felt like he was feeling more than me. And then, like you said earlier, that my self-judgment kicked in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and likely he was, and there was nothing like right or wrong about that. And it could be that he'd, like you said, like he had more that was willing to move in that moment. Now, it could be that he has processed like experiences in a different way than you. It could be that you process experiences very, very differently. And this is where the breath, whilst we're changing the mechanics of breathing, right? So really I'm looking at like, how do the intercostal muscles move? How do the diaphragms move? That's really the fundamental, what I do with breath. But outside of that, what I'm really looking at is how do you perceive your own breathing rhythm, which is this little tiny piece of self-judgment that's coming up. Oh, am I doing it right? This is inquiry, right? So there's a perception of yourself. How is your mind thinking about the experience? How are you in touch with your own emotional landscape? And then what's going on in the underlying behavior that's present in your breathing rhythms? So really what we're looking at is thoughts, emotions and feelings, perception, and patterns of behavior. And that's kind of a slightly modified cognitive behavioral therapy framework that we use. So we're kind of looking at CBT and we're looking at that and being like, okay, how does this overlay into breathing? And then what's the underlying tone in the patterns of behavior that are presenting in the breath and in this human? And what's fascinating, of course, breath changes emotional state, which changes your thoughts and your perception. But then your perception also changes your thoughts and your breath and your patterns of behavior. So they're all interconnected. And any one of those is an entry point into greater self-awareness.
So is that really the end goal then with the breath work, is to have greater self-awareness and to feel more, release traumas? Or what's the main goal for you?
Yeah. I suppose, a greater understanding of ourselves, a greater awareness of ourselves. And with that, a greater capacity to meet life. And life is dynamic and complicated and nuanced. And so, we'd like a breathing rhythm that can handle stress load well and that can recover well. So I think, really what we look at is capacity and resilience. So how is it that we can handle a lot of stress? How can we do that frequently? And how can we return to a baseline of a good level of relaxation consistently in life?
Do I have to do breath work in order to get the benefits, or can I just implement certain practices every day in my breath? Be conscious of, like, for example, being more aware of how I breathe and doing like box breathing, for example. Yeah. What are the things I can do? People can do practically on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, thanks, bro. So, I mean, there's the first thing is just to become aware, right? The first inquiry is like, how am I breathing? And when we ask ourselves this, is just like for me around the age of 30, it was like, I don't know. Like, how is it that I've lived this many years and I don't actually understand and feel the mechanics of my own breath? I don't understand how oxygen and carbon dioxide is moving through my body. And it was amazing that I'd studied so many different things and I'd traveled a lot and I'd explored the world out there. But really, if I sat cross-legged with myself, there was just this whole inner landscape that I knew so very little about and was not really into or in tune with. And, some of the practices that I know that you've explored around intermittent fasting and around, food choices and just changing like the way we relate to substances and ourselves, there's so much there. Like, there's so much richness and gold. And so I had the same experience with breath. So there are many different ways we can explore this. Initially, I think our first inquiry is kind of like, how am I breathing? And we just start to observe it, right? Yeah. And then we bring in some practices. We use maybe a box breath. We start noticing what's it like to start practicing some retentions, which are very powerful and we have to be quite careful with. And then, like for me, there was a blindness. I was like, I didn't really know what I was doing. So there's great value in seeking a teacher that's probably walked the path already. And there's plenty of great breath teachers out there. There's plenty of terrible ones as well. And so it's like most things in life, we just got to be aware of like,
how has someone gone about learning what they learned? Is it based on their own anecdotal experience? Is it based on clinical research? Is it based on a wide variety of other people that they've worked with? And then outside of that, we just kind of start working with different tools. For me, connected breathing is the sharpest tool. And so as it's the sharpest tool, we probably want someone that's skilled to work with. You know, it's like discount heart surgery. It's not something I'm going to sign up for. It's kind of in the same realm as discount sushi. Yeah. I don't do it, you know, and so I want to pay full price. Yeah. And if someone's going to operate on my heart, I want to pay not only full price, but probably like I associate price with quality when it comes to heart surgery, and the same with sushi and the same with breathwork. We're changing the subconscious, unconscious processes of breathing rhythms in the subconscious mind. We're changing how we breathe 23 to 26,000 times a day. I want someone that knows what they're doing. Yeah, so if we're going to use connected breathing, it's a really sharp, direct, poignant tool, and we want someone that is effectively trained. So we want to have some good questions to ask, you know. Obvious ones like, you know, do they understand the balances of what's going on? Do they understand mechanics of breathing? Do they understand the foundation of the nervous system? Those would be great questions to ask the practitioner. What's their own practice like? Yeah, just like simple things like that. And then, yeah, like the reason it's such a powerful tool is because we're entering into trance. So we're going into altered states of consciousness or non-ordinary states of consciousness and awareness. And then we become really malleable. So we can start to bring up experiences that we haven't processed, that we might have stuffed down and buffered really, really well. And suddenly these things start to emerge. And we just don't want them all to come up at the same time. You know, we don't want to unpack everything.
I have some friends who they don't think breathwork is good. They're just like, yeah, dude, like, why would you do that? Like you've never tried it, so you don't know. I want to try stuff so I can have a point of reference to talk about. I want to have the experience.
Yeah.
And so for me, it brought up a lot of things, like you just said, like I wasn't aware of. Like our session that we had, the one-on-one session, I just felt immense pride. Like it was so intense. It was just like, it was beautiful. And like, I never thought that I would have felt that much pride for myself and, you know, just being really proud of myself.
Yeah.
But that's what I felt in that session. You know?
It was amazing because I remember, without going into too many details, without checking in first, but I remember you sharing your story. And before we went into the journey, you were sharing your story about, how far you'd come and some of your amazing achievements in life and what it had taken to get there. And I remember the session just being this kind of huge celebration, you know, of reflection, firstly, of your own story, of some of the challenges that you'd had, you know, in growing up and some of the challenges that you'd faced and how you had assimilated those into ultimately what could have been, you know, experiences that had crushed you, you know, but somehow you'd found growth from that. You had lent into it and you'd found that those challenges had actually, you know, made you stronger. And then when you dropped into breath, there was this feeling sense, it was a celebration. And I remember also kind of you sharing that instead of moving on to the next thing, you had an opportunity to kind of reflect on that and be like, oh, I'm actually doing pretty good here. And I genuinely love how the conversation I have before a breathwork journey changes someone's experience so profoundly. We can just have a different conversation and it brings up all of these pieces into your conscious mind. And then you drop in and breathe for an hour and it's just like, it's all just whirling around in there. And then it just kind of creates this like singularity that then drops between the old story and the current reality. And I don't know what's happening. I can't even begin to imagine. There's this amazing clarity that clients have at the end of the journey where they come out and there's a embodied feeling state that's now emerged from the cognitive expression.
Yeah, and after that session, I was just, it was, like you said, the clarity that you get from that. And one of the things I want to touch on is when you mentioned, we're going to breathe for like an hour and a half, hour and a quarter, I was like, bloody hell, that's a long time. How am I going to do this? Yeah, it is. But then it literally feels like about 10 minutes. That's how it feels, even though it's for an hour and a quarter or hour, you know? Time,
is very relative in that space. And I've had journeys that have lasted what seemed like 5 hours and it's still an hour and a quarter. And there are journeys where you lie down and you connect the breath and you come out the other end and you're like, we're done already? But then there's this sort of this when then pressed or asked about like what happened in your journey, do you remember this? Do you remember this? It's kind of starts to emerge again. We're like, oh, I did that. Oh, I remember shaking, or I remember pushing into your hands, or wow. And so it's very interesting how non-ordinary our state of awareness and consciousness is in that state. And I love what you said about people that don't have any frame of reference speaking about it. And I had to humbly admit there was a lot that I didn't know about in terms of subjects like fasting or, being vegan. It's like, I can bash vegans all I wanted, but until I went vegan for a month, I didn't know what they were talking about. It's the same with carnivore. Yep. Like if I press into that and I go, oh, well, it doesn't make any sense, but I mean, cognitively, maybe not, right? But if I go and experience it and I try it, I have a embodied feeling understanding of what happened for me. Yep. Now, it's still anecdotal for sure. Yep. But when we take all of those experiences and we look at them, now there's something here. And ultimately, it's the same with psychedelics. If you've never tried, it's the same with snow. I kind of use snow as the analogy because it's less political and maybe a little less risky. But the essence is like, we're in Bali, unlikely to have snow anytime soon. Fingers crossed. And so if I attempt to explain cognitively what snow is to an Indonesian, they can grasp it. They can maybe have experienced ice, or a walk-in freezer, so they have an understanding of cold. But still, the idea that snow would be falling from the sky in such a volume as we'd have back home in Canada, they cannot actually understand the feeling state of the body when you're in that. And so, like your friends who laugh about breath work, it's like, yeah, sure, come and have an experience and then we'll talk. Then we'll see if it changes your lens of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the intention before the session is important, right? But you always have us set in an intention before we actually go and breathe. Yeah,
you're going to breathe for an hour and a quarter. So it's important that we're focusing on something we would like. And intention is a very interesting thing because, when we think of it, it's like, I want to let go of stress. Well, the only word I really heard in my subconscious was stress. So if we would say then I would like to create more ease, the word I hear is ease. And so the repetitive focus is ease. And if we're going to breathe for an hour and a quarter, we'd like to be focusing on something that we'd like to invite in and not something that we don't want. The double negation's tough in our subconscious mind. So framing intention is important.
That's literally one of the biggest problems in humanity, though. It's like we always focus on what we don't want instead of what we actually want.
Yeah, and it's such a simple thing, right? It's like really like, trying to push away something is not actually focusing on what we're moving towards. There's really two ways to operate in life. Like we can try and push away our fears, or we can focus on the opposite of what is it that I would create with them. Capacity and resilience as focal points for creation in my nervous system and my life, along with dynamism, likely are going to well prepare me for challenges and rigor. So instead of pushing away the reality of the fact that life is tough on occasion, if we're building up like a way that we can approach those things, I think it's a lot easier to navigate.
Yeah. So what is the nervous system? Like you mentioned that a few times, and that's what the breath controls the nervous system. Right?
The breath impacts the nervous system. The nervous system ultimately, it's our cells, our human cells can specialize into different functionality, right? We have skin cells, we have liver cells, and we have nerve cells. And nerve cells are specialized mostly to conduct electrical impulses. And so the nervous system are collections of cells in a web that's through the body. If you Google nervous system, you'll get the web of the nervous system. So it includes the spinal cord column and then all of the other peripheral nerves of sensory and motor. And it moves into the low brain. And so the nervous system is conveying the information from our body to our brain and back again. And it's also conveying information from our external world into our internal landscape. So our senses, taste, touch, hearing, and our vision and smell. So those big senses that we kind of speak to, the big five senses. And And then there are sort of more subsenses around like how I feel in my internal landscape, which would be interoception. And with that, our breathing rhythm provides us with information about our body. How we're breathing and where we're breathing gives us another set of information. And so initially that's quite subconscious, unconscious, but we can start to become aware of how we're breathing, which gives us another kind of layer to our feeling experience. And then underneath that, we've also got the endocrine system, which is our glands. And over time, we can touch into how our glands are functioning, and we can start to become more deeply aware of our glands, which is like, how is my blood chemistry in this moment? And we can ask ourselves that question, and we can actually become aware of the level of adrenaline we might have. And so we're deepening our senses and our sense of self. Now, our nervous system conveys that information, and then it actually prepares us. So it might mobilize the adrenal glands for action. So the example I give you is we're sitting here having this podcast, and a tiger walks in. Now, before I have consciously thought tiger, thankfully my subconscious has already fired my adrenaline glands to prepare for action. Now, that subconscious mobilization of energy happens before thought. So conscious thought's not really running the show, subconscious is. It's mobilizing my energy. If I had some sort of misperception between the stimulus of the tiger walking in and my subconscious response, I wouldn't mobilize very quickly. And that would leave me prey. Now, ultimately, that's going to affect how rapidly my response times are. In terms of human evolution, that would leave me dead. So we want to have correct perception of threat. Mm-hmm. So the nervous system is basically taking in our external landscape. It's taking in all of the information, and then it's creating a preparedness in our internal landscape for that. And it is the way that we communicate. It is in the subconscious divided into, in the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, it's divided into what we call the two branches, which is the sympathetic, which builds tone or readiness, and the parasympathetic, which builds relaxation. Now, it's not a binary, both happen simultaneously. It would be great if it was just on or off, but it's not. Like, life is complicated and so are humans. So think of one as like the gas pedal and the other one as the brake, right? And if we've got gas and brake, when we're driving, we are actually pulsing all the time between both. We don't want to use both simultaneously often, but on occasion we come off the gas whilst we hit the brake. So they're both sometimes present. Within the braking system of a vehicle, a car has the foot brake, which we'll use more often, and then the hand or e-brake, which we'll use only in emergencies. The parasympathetic nervous system kind of has the same thing. It has two branches. We're getting a little bit technical, but this is polyvagal theory. It has the ventral branch, which is the sort of the human social engagement branch, which is also using touch and how we kind of regulate ourselves. And then it has what we call the dorsal branch, which is more of the emergency branch, which is the freeze response. And the freeze response is really useful. It's playing dead, and it shuts us down. And it's if the tiger attacked me and mauled me, I would want to play dead so that it would think I was dead and it would leave me and go and get its cubs and come back and feed on me. In that moment, I might have a chance to escape. So yeah, basically the nervous system is activating and relaxing. It's doing it all the time. It's doing it even in sleep. And what we'd like is good levels of activation, so we can activate or not activate, and good levels of relaxation, so we can relax or not relax. Now, these are happening simultaneously. I can be, strangely enough, actively relaxed. And what that means is flow. So when we enter a flow state, we have challenge and competence. They're both present. And that's when we drop into flow. Now, the opposite of that is no activation and very little relaxation, which is depression. So on these scales, we have anxiety, which is a lot of activation, but not much relaxation. And then we have a lot of relaxation, but not much activation, which is, sleep or very, very low tone in the system in general. So yeah, we read this. We read this through rhythms of breath, but we also read it through muscle tone, tensing in the vocal cords, facial expression, and then the subtle energy of how someone might be like twitching or moving or shaking.
So you can tell if someone's depressed just by their breath pattern?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. So we can see systemically what's under the hood. right? So again, like if someone's got very little breath moving in the body consistently, like journey on journey, that's a systemic thing that we can see. And we can guide more activation in the inhale, which builds tone in the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, which starts to activate them, which then conveys that information to their endocrine system, to their glands, and builds their blood chemistry. So then their adrenaline would start to come online. Now, if that starts to activate, but they don't have access to relaxation, that's not going to be very helpful. So what we do with clients is we need to build both activation and relaxation simultaneously. So I can also see when someone has anxiety because they don't have a very good exhale.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So what we're reading is the mechanics of breath over time. So I'm not looking at breath statically. I stress load. And why stress loading, with you as an example, I start to build your inhale. And then I see, how does Aaron do when I build his inhale? Well, actually quite good. You hold good stability and you exhale well. And that's because of, your practices and the way that you live and the life you've created for yourself. Now, with certain individuals, when I build the inhale voluminously, as an example, they'll start to maybe bring in some compensation movement patterns or breathing patterns. So they might start to use their upper back or their shoulders or the vocal cords to limit in some way. So they become uncomfortable in their own power. And that's what we're exploring.
I see. So when someone's doing the connected breathing, and connected breathing is the loop. Sorry, I get mixed up. Loop breath is the.
Yeah.
Is that also connected breathing?
Yeah, that's the same. So we say looping or connected.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when someone's doing that, aren't they're activating their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response?
Can be.
Okay.
But what it depends on is the quality of the exhale that's present with it. Yeah. So we're reading both the volume of the breath, both on the inhale and the exhale. And as voluminous as my inhale, I want my exhale to be equally relaxed. And what that's building is the activation with relaxation. So that allows me to stay present in my activation. Now, if I build too much activation without enough relaxation, if the gap between these gets too big, my body's going to pull the e-brake. So that's when basically it snaps a fuse and it says, this isn't safe for you, and we're going to put you into a freeze. Now, that can be really healthy. I would want that if my system's overloading or I'm exposed to a lot of pain, as an example, right? I would want my body to be like, you cannot face this anymore, and now you need to shut down. But I wouldn't want that to happen if I'm having a chat with my boss. That would not be a good point to disassociate. Yeah. And it can happen. So what we're reading is, how comfortable am I staying? How comfortable am I staying with myself in all of these states of function? Yeah, and that's what I'm testing repeatedly with clients. And it can be as well. Some clients have shadow over relaxation, like they don't want to relax. That doesn't feel safe. And that can be, it wasn't safe to relax as a child, or relaxation was shamed, or relaxation was guilted. Yeah, so we have essentially a cross pattern or cross wiring in the behavior. So we've associated a certain state with another emotional response. Yeah.
Yeah, so that must be tough when you experience that, when they can't exhale properly.
Yeah.
Does that frustrate you, or because if they don't want to go there, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, initially when I was training, it was like, and they won't do what I want them to do. That judgment is really not serving them or me, right? And so what I move into is this space of deep wisdom and understanding for the human, right? There's an intelligence far greater than me that's present in this human, than my conscious mind, right? And basically what's happening is they've learned a pattern of behavior at some point in their life that they needed. And now they're still operating in that way, but the reality is they don't need it anymore. It's not serving. And I love the phrase, like, our solutions in our childhood become our problems in our adulthood. And powerful. Yeah, so it's like, I have these adaptive patterns. Now, patterns of behavior generally, like, let's take people-pleasing as an example. People-pleasing is amazing. Like, I love pleasing people. I want to see people content. It brings me joy. If I don't do it enough, I'm generally not very enjoyable or agreeable to be around. If I do it at the expense of myself, I'm over-giving and it's depleting. And that's actually not, I'm not giving. now. I'm giving from a space of lack, and I'm attempting to modulate someone else's experience without actually being in a space of abundance or having that gift to give. Now, both of these are on the extreme ends of a pattern of behavior, and this is when it's unhealthy. But in the kind of middle space, people pleasing is healthy for humans, and it gets villainized on the pop Instagram kind of snapshot thing. People pleasing is bad. Stop being a people pleaser. Well, like, we've just gone binary, and there's no opportunity for nuance or complexity or grayness. We want to be in the middle, right? So people pleasing as a pattern of behavior in childhood, on the extreme end as a learned behavior, could be damaging. In childhood, it might be what we need to get through like life with our parents, depending on their patterns of behavior. So what we may learn is that we're overgivers. And when we wake up to this fact in relationship, that might show up as codependency. We choose partners that can't give. We move into this kind of savior mentality, and we give. And that feels really safe and comfortable. We don't feel comfortable receiving from somebody else, so we choose someone that can't actually give to us. So what we've created is a dynamic from our childhood that's very familiar and very safe. But ultimately, it's actually very painful because we're not receiving, and we're not in reciprocity, we're not in flow. And in romantic relating, that's only going to go on for so long before passive-aggressive behavior comes up and we start to become frustrated with our partner. So when we explore that, as an example, people-pleasing, that might show up in a client. They might want to impress me with how great their pattern of breathing is. And it's just interesting because like, I'm not there to give feedback over like how well they do. Oh, 9 out of 10 on your breathing, well done. I'm indifferent, there's no like stars or grades in this practice. It's an inquiry into like, how good are you at being with yourself? That's all I'm looking at.
Yeah.
So yeah, we unpack that and we just see what emerges.
And then when you're able to just discover all of these patterns in just people's breath, which I find just mind-boggling. Like people, like I don't know what you saw in me during the times I've been at breathing with you, but it's just like I kind of feel naked in a way because you're like you can see everything.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's kind of initially I don't tell clients that I'm on this podcast, and now people will know this, but initially when clients work with me, they don't really have an understanding of what I can see and what I can read. And sometimes when I teach, people are like, how do you know this about humans? And I'm like, because it's all there, right? So initially it can be actually quite mystical. They're like, oh, you're so intuitive. And I'm like, no, maybe, but no. So it's like, there's probably some sort of element that over time I've got very good at reading people very quickly. But really what I'm reading is breathing rhythms, motor patterns, eye twitch, all of these subtle elements. And it's just practice over time. Now, I'm mindful to admit that I'm not really special or gifted or unique in this because I teach practitioners. We've got 25 people on the team, and I've replicated the capacity to read this. So it's definitely not me, it's definitely human. And I like that, right? Because it's important to separate. Sure, maybe there's certain gifts that I have that I'm, on a spectrum a little bit more talented in certain areas. But on the whole, anyone can be a really solid breath worker. And yeah, we've got like a spectrum on the team. Some people have great qualities of touch. Some people are really good with language and communication. Some people are very good all-rounders. Some people are very organized. Some people read breath in slightly more subtle or different ways. But it's teachable.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is disarming, and it can be quite humbling. And at the same time, when we continue to be reminded that it's all welcome and we learn these patterns, and also that all of these patterns are in all of us. It's just all we're testing is like, oh, do we move into the extremes at any point? And ultimately what we look at is this idea of propping and collapsing. When is it that someone uses a pattern in either one end? So when is it that someone collapses, or when is it that someone overprops? And all we're seeing, we're just ultimately creating more of the middle way. So instead of going into patterns of behavior that might be somewhat maladaptive, we're just ensuring that people have good ways of relating to themselves, to the environment, and to other humans. And it just creates a lot more harmony in the way that we live.
Yeah. And how do they continue this outside of the sessions? Like how does it affect how they breathe outside of the sessions?
Well, so thank you. So what's like what's really great about connected breathing is it's the sharpest tool in the box that I've discovered, right? And with that, it needs to be, respected and operated. We need to operate it with care. And at the same time, once we change someone's breathing rhythm, it is changed. So this is what's fascinating. There's no more work to do. Like the breathing rhythm, it's done. Now, where it would revert is if the environmental factors are still creating the need to operate in a certain way. I'll give you the example. If someone's in an abusive relationship and they come to me and we start working, if they continue in that abusive relationship, the environment is going to continue to ask them to operate in a certain way. So they're going to have to change the environment. Otherwise, it's going to continue to create challenge. Now, I'll give you another example. A CEO, right, that is operating in a certain way that has a huge amount of pressure of work. If I start working with them, we're going to start peeling away these patterns. They're going to have to change the way that they meet their workload. And what that means is they're going to probably have to become a lot more efficient in the way that they maybe delegate. So we're finding ways that patterns of behavior are impacting breath and breath is impacting patterns of behavior. What we want to see is those feedback loops are supportive. And sometimes that means that needs to be an environmental shift in some way. And so this is where this work is kind of steady and deliberate over time. I like working with clients over time. Like for me, when I work with a client for 3 months or 6 months, sometimes I work with clients for a year at a time, which is epic. Their whole world changes. They don't necessarily have a need to quit their job or, move to a monastery. They are actually just able to continue to do what they do, but they do it with so much more ease and grace. And their capacity increases, their functionality increases. They're just more pleasant to be around as individuals. Yeah. So I think, just circling back, there's not really a need for them to continue to do the work because we're creating such deep foundational bottom-up functional changes. And they just like to continue to practice because it's fun. But yeah, on the daily practice kind of level, there's not a huge need to. Pranayamas or Wim Hof, because it's not a very effective way of creating change, you need to do a lot of it.
That's a good one.
So, it's like when you choose very effective ways of creating change and then you apply them, you're going to create massive amounts of change. And so, it would be the same with me, with body work as an example, right? If I'm having massage or body work done, if I go to a local Balinese masseuse here, generally, I walk into a spa, they've not been effectively trained, they don't understand the mechanics of the body. I have a massage, it feels great. I walk out and 3 days later, likely a lot of those stiffnesses or patterns have reverted. I go back in for more body work. Now, if I go here and I go to someone, I'll give an example and I'll name him, like Eddie Ulm or Ash Parkhurst, right? Now, these are two guys who are absolute weapons. If I go and I lie on the treatment table with Ash, who we've been working with recently, he's a sniper. He's so precise. He knows exactly which muscles are firing and co-firing. He works in ligament, tendon, fascia, and he's going to cause me 10 out of 10 pain. But the next day, my functional movement has shifted and it's noticeable. I only need to go and see him once for him to move a pattern. I only need to go and see him once for him to change the functioning of my quadricep, right? Because he's so good at what he does. It's vigorous, it's direct, and it's painful. And it creates lasting change. Now, I'd prefer to see him and invest in that than 20 ineffective treatments. So again, it's choose your adventure. And it's likely the same with food protocols. We can make very small changes, which might be effective, over a longer period of time, or we can go and work with someone that's very, very detail orientated, that's focusing on us as an individual, that's maybe doing a lot of lab testing on the side as well, and that finds out these are the lowest hanging fruit. Let's just create these changes. Find out you've got a gluten allergy, as a the first thing you do is go get allergy testing and find out, I'm allergic to lentils and gluten. Great, cut those out of my diet. Guess what happens? That's an 80% increase in nutrient uptake. Approximately, right? Wow, that's worthwhile. So yeah, with breath, it's the same. I can do these very dull, ineffective practices for a long period of time. Likely I'll get there, but I prefer to work with someone that's just gets it,
So essentially what you're saying is if you're doing the breath work properly, for example, with your Breathwork Bali team, then you're going to not need to do this Wim Hof stuff and the daily breathwork exercises that touted out there online.
Yeah, like the body knows how to breathe. The subconscious breathing pattern, like it knows how to breathe way better than the conscious mind. There's a lot of things we know how to do subconsciously a lot better. Now, the reason, like when we learn to walk, like ideally we learn how to walk. I didn't, like my son's 3.5, I didn't teach him how to walk, he learned. He learned how to walk. Imagine, like he learned through trial and error. Well, breathing is foundational in the great deep wisdom of the body. No one taught us how to breathe. We came in fully loaded, right? So it's actually a misperception that we would need to train ourselves how to breathe. We just need to unlearn and remember. So let's just like think about that. My conscious mind cannot teach me how to breathe. I need to unlearn all of the adaptive patterns that I've built up over time. Once I've unlearned them, there's nothing more to learn. So it's a remembering and an unlearning. That's what we do. So if I try and teach someone how to breathe, guess what? I'm stacking more egotistical frontal mind knowledge onto an adaptive pattern. And anybody that attempts to teach people how to breathe that doesn't operate from a space of remembering, unlearning from deep functional mechanics is likely adding more maladaption to maladaption. And this is where these practices that are prescription, top-down based, aren't going to actually serve the client. So, I want to really ask the question, am I actually serving the client? Am I actually helping them? And if I create more propping, which is likely what I'm going to do with a prescriptive-based breathing method, I'm going to create more propping or more maladaptive strategies. I actually just want to peel all of the adaptive strategies away. And that can be quite a humbling experience.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of one of my sessions I had with one of my friends here. He's practicing breath work, and he taught me a different strategy. It was like
yeah.
I'm not sure what that's called, but
yeah. So 2-part inhale. Yeah. So we're breathing into the belly for a part and into the chest for a part. Yeah. So basically, we're changing diaphragm function. We get the diaphragm to breathe down, and then the intercostals to breathe up. And those are the 2 parts to the breath in the mechanics of breathing. We go, and then we go. So that's kind of what we're doing. So you're creating that pause kind of creates that separation between belly and then chest. And we can create a 3-part breath as well if we really wanted to.
I think I did that too.
Yeah. 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 So we're still using the cognitive mind to create an inhale, but we're allowing the exhale to fully relax. So again, this is a slight blend between a rhythmical connected breath with still a slight focal point on a single or double or triple inhale. Yeah, some benefit to it, and it depends. If someone's got a big, full, voluminous inhale, that's not going to serve them, right? And if someone's got holding or control on the exhale, it's actually going to build that activation tone without allowing the relaxation. Now, knowing your breathing rhythm, I imagine it was probably quite an enjoyable session.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But then my feet, my fingers.
Yeah. So then you're moving into a space of tetany, T-E-T-A-N-Y, which is an imbalance of oxygen, calcium, and carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. And it leads to cramping in your nervous system. So this is your nervous system wishing to kind of shut you down a bit, but you not allowing it. So this is where your activation response has got too big. Your relaxation response hasn't come high enough with it. So there's still a little lack of exhale.
Yes.
That gap creates cramping. And so what we do is we want to close the gap. There's 2 ways. We either drop the inhale or we build your exhale. Now, ideally, we build your exhale over time. But we just want to see that as voluminous as your inhale is, your exhale is equally relaxed. And that negates that tetany response.
Yeah, because that's not safe, is it? When you had that gap. When you're cramping like that, is that safe?
I mean, it's safe because the body does it, but it's ultimately the disconnect between the conscious mind and the subconscious breathing pattern. And what we'd like to see is just that relaxation response. So if a practitioner was to drive you into that for a long period of time, it would be quite unsafe. The reason it's unsafe is it creates respiratory alkalosis. It creates an imbalance in calcium and carbon dioxide. It's going to put a little bit of taxation onto the kidneys because they then have to buffer your pH. And likely it creates a shift in your blood chemistry, which can leave you like a bit disorientated. So as a practitioner, we don't teach double or triple inhale for that very reason. That's why our school doesn't do it.
I see.
Right? So we would prefer to see gently building the relaxation response to meet the inhale. You already got a good inhale. We don't need to focus too much on that. What I'd love to see is this relaxation response. I'd like to build that and the deeper connection to yourself, the deeper feeling state. Now, that feeling state doesn't come with activation, because when you activate, you build adrenaline. And when you build adrenaline, then you're going to need cortisol afterwards to relax. And cortisol has a tendency to numb us. So when we build cortisol, we tend to lack interoception, which is our capacity to feel ourselves. So this is where if you have baseline cortisol levels that are too high, you don't have the capacity to feel your internal landscape as much. So instead of building adrenaline tone, we like to just actually build relaxation response. Then you can stay optimized, you can stay activated for longer and feel yourself more deeply. And that's really what we'd love to see.
Yeah, because the box was not the connected breathing is, I like that. It's just breathing in and out.
Yeah.
It's because for me, like you said, this is what I want to touch on is the feeling, because that was my intention before before I was like, I just want to feel more. Yeah. And that's something that, as you could see in my breath pattern, I kind of struggle with is feeling fully. And so the exhale is connected with how well you can access your emotions. Is that correct? Yeah,
there's a certain quality that as you're dropping your exhale, your capacity to feel yourself deepens because your relaxation response is fuller. And so the more relaxed you are, that's like your parasympathetic branch. As your relaxation response builds, you get more in touch with yourself. So in general, with your breathing rhythm as an example, I would focus on building your awareness of your relaxation response to a much deeper level such that you can really feel, really deeply. I mean, and here's the thing as well, bro, like you're good, like it's you're well optimized, but the level and depth that we get to with the subtleties of breathing, like we're fine tuning, like we're getting into like the final percentages of like what it is to be really feel the depth of this human experience with breathing rhythms like yourself. With a lot of clients, we're working with lots of propping, lots of maladaptation, lots of collapsing, right? So, we're initially we're just creating foundational activation and relaxation. Most of the clients I work with in Bali, they're just curious on they want to get that last few percent, right? And I love working at that level. It tests me as well as a practitioner. And I have a tendency to work with clients that just want to do that because it's the most enjoyable for me. So yeah, with you, we've already got, good capacity, the way that you're showing up in life as well, the way that you live, life is flowing well for you, and that showed up in your voluminous inhale. But yeah, just how to get more in touch with the fullness and richness of your emotional experience of life. That's what I'm interested in cultivating for you and with you. And that comes in the relaxation. So lots of touch work, lots of long relaxation periods. In the terms of the journey, not too much activation, but a long relaxation and rest response. And then seeing what emerges in that. And this is when we get like insights and flashbacks and clarity and like a deeper embodiment of you. On the Wednesday session, you had your breath dropped into your pelvis a lot more as well. I don't know if that was like...
was that you supporting me?
Yeah, so it was me and one other. And
yeah.
It was really fun just to witness how the breath dropped into the pelvic space. And that was changing the functionality of your pelvic floor. And the pelvis receives breath as well. And we can repattern how the pelvis receives breath, which much more deeply connects us to the whole of the pelvic region, which has spillovers into, how we are in touch with our own sexual energy as well, both in men and women. And then suddenly, this is kind of the gateway into some of those more interesting experiences of cultivating and moving breath and energy through that space.
And the hips contains the hips is where you store a lot of your emotions, right?
So it's interesting because, we really only store emotions in our brain.
Okay.
So, and that's a common kind of quote in yoga and in, I notice you got the Bessel van der Kolk book here as well, Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Now the body presents adaptive patterns and breathing patterns, but when I talked about the specialization of cells, really the only cells in the body that have memory are in the brain. Our skin cells don't have memory. They're not specialized for that, right? Our nerve cells, they just convey information. They're not specialized for memory. It's the brain that remembers. So the low brain and the midbrain remembers how to walk, as an example. Our subconscious, it remembers how to reverse out of our driveway, right? How to hit a golf club. Those things become subconscious. We learn them until we don't need to remember them anymore, right? And so our pelvic movement is quite subconscious, but it can become conscious again. And so we can use movement. There's a few things that we can use to bridge the gap between our conscious and subconscious. The most obvious is breathing. After that is actually our vision. If we move our vision from peripheral to narrow, peripheral vision is very relaxing, narrow vision is very activating. So breathing and vision are the two most easeful ways to change sympathetic and parasympathetic state. After that is actually movement, and we can use movement as an access point into our subconscious. And so, a long-winded way of answering your question. The functionality of movement in our pelvis is stored in our subconscious until it's not anymore, until we make it conscious, and then we can improve the functionality of that. Now, the association of the pelvis is actually with shame, and then we associate guilt as an emotional response in this area. So this is kind of like these breathing rhythms are associated with this area. We're starting to track that a little bit more, and hopefully we'll get some more kind of like concrete clinical data on that. Which areas of the brain change when we breathe in the pelvis? And that's the next kind of question that we have as a research team. So it's like, okay, well, when people don't breathe in the pelvis, they tend to have a challenging relationship to shame, both internalized and how they perceive it in the world. So we want to get people being able to breathe more fully and deeply into their pelvis. And if that happens, then our kind of curiosity is what happens in the brain then? Which area of the brain lights up with breath in the pelvis? Because the endocrine system changes as well when we breathe more fully into our sexual organs, when we breathe more fully into this whole area, it impacts our blood chemistry. It's
so
tech now.
Increasing like blood flow down there for men, for example, just from breathing in your pelvis.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we change prostate function as an example, right? So think about the pelvic bowl. You've got all of the interwoven muscles, and they are holding the organs. So the large intestine, small intestine, sexual organs are all moved by breath. Now the air enters the lungs, but breath moves through the whole body. If we take a big deep breath, we can actually breathe all the way into the pelvic floor. And that's what we read. So we read the shape of breath. We read, does someone just breathe in the diaphragm? Do they breathe in the top of the lung? Or do they breathe all the way in the pelvis? And in your session, when you lay down, you are initially breathing in the rib cage, in the diaphragm and the rib cage. And then as the session progressed, your diaphragm function started to move down more and more. And then I facilitated your pelvis, and the breath filled into the pelvis. And this brings this feeling state of being really grounded. And this is where we get a huge amount of presence from. When we're breathing all the way into the pelvis, we're super present with ourselves.
That's cool. So so with that, is that why you tell people to breathe through their mouth and not through their nose during the session?
Yeah.
So we can activate the pelvis.
Yeah. So, I mean, all ways of breathing can be good. It depends. Mouth breathing's great. We want to mostly mouth breathe. We've got lots of filters here. It spirals the air. It changes nitrous oxide production. It has a lot of different impacts. Now, aperture size of the nose is a lot smaller than mouth. So I bring in a slower, steadier volume of breath. I would want to mouth breathe if I need rapid shifts in my system. So there's two things that we spontaneously do. We yawn and we sigh. Those are both mouth breaths. And they upregulate and downregulate the system, right? So we need them. They're really important. Similarly, if I need to sprint rapidly, like really rapidly, I would want to gasp initially to get massive oxygen uptake, but then I would probably, for longevity, want to switch to a nose breath. So yeah, nose breath can be great, mouth breath can be great, it depends. Gasping, as an example, a shock response, we need that. That mobilizes us for action. It's a threat response, right? And so we wouldn't want that to be limited or not available. And similarly, sighing, we would want the sigh to be available because it helps us to soften. Now, in our practice, we mouth breathe because it actually creates a larger aperture so we can stress test all of the rhythms of breath. So it can be good to just nose breathe, then we can just keep it very steady and shallow. But what I want to see is, are you comfortable with big volumes of breathing for an extended period of time? That's really what I'm testing in your system. And what I'm testing is capacity and resilience. How big can you breathe for how long? And yeah, normally we'll find our clients hit an edge pretty quickly. So over practice over time, I would like to see that someone can breathe big volumes from the pelvic floor to the top of the ribs, steadily, consistently for the duration, for at least 20 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's cool because now you can see how they deal with certain things and what's going on for them, what's coming up in their life based on how they're breathing, their capacity to handle the inhale and the exhale.
Exactly.
All the different patterns.
So what we're actually looking at is amygdala function. So I'm looking at the functioning of the amygdala and the limbic system of the brain, which is our emotional area. This is where we receive the information from the body and the blood chemistry. So our glands change our blood chemistry, and then our blood pumps around, and then it enters the brain. And our brain is getting the information from our body. So the nervous system's conveying information, but so is the endocrine system. And the endocrine system, it sends these blood chemical markers up into the brain, and it sends them, into the pituitary gland, which is the master gland of the body. And it kind of is saying, you're safe or you're not safe. And the amygdala is this gap between perceptive response, i.e. tiger, and how my pituitary gland creates a flood of top-down chemicals into my body, and then all of my other glands respond. So we have this cascading effect, right? Perception, response, blood chemical cascade, and then in that moment, what do I do? So this is amygdala function. And what we're doing is we're testing that by creating a threat response through the rhythm of breath. So we've taken away external perception, we're triggering a breathing response, and then we're inquiring what happens to blood chemistry, and then how do you respond to blood chemistry? And then we test it again. And it's fascinating.
Yeah. And add into that, what are the biggest things, transformations you've seen? How has breathwork changed your life personally? Since you started, a decade ago now? Yeah,
thank you. So I started with movement, exploring movement and breathing, close to a decade ago. It wasn't out of choice. It wasn't out of I'm doing quite well in life and I'd like to explore this. At the time, I was suffering from PTSD. So I had been caught in an avalanche. And so, in a previous chapter of my life, I worked in a restaurant and I skied. I lived in Canada in the mountains in a town called Whistler. It's an amazing ski resort, and I had a very active and vibrant life. I would ski in the day and I'd work in the restaurant in the evening. And I was skiing a lot of different terrain, and I was really pushing the envelope of what we could explore. And one day I was skiing in a self-propelled way. So I'd hiked out of bounds. I was in an area that wasn't avalanche controlled. And I got caught in an avalanche. And it was a class 2, so it was big enough to create what I thought was my death. So I had a near-death experience. And basically the mountain came with me. I got carried for about 50, 60 meters down the side of the mountain. I was tumbling and ragdolling in all of this mountain of snow. And when I came to a stop, I was buried up to my chest. So thankfully my head was above the snow. But at the time, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And I fought for my life. And it created such a huge adrenaline response at a time in my life where I was already quite burnt out. So I had been working for 3 years in the restaurant business. And I was already kind of deciding that this wasn't a path I wanted to pursue and I needed to exit. And then I compounded it with this near-death experience. And it was challenging because when I came kind of out of the experience, I was still out of bounds. I was halfway off the back of a mountain. So I needed to get back into safety. And the mountain side had just slid. So it was likely that all of the terrain we were in was now high risk. And it was March and it was sun exposure. So everything was starting to melt. So, every pitch that we were going to potentially travel on could have slid as well. So we were in this hazardous terrain. So it took some basically had to compose myself, get my gear back together and hike out and then get back into safety. And so I did. I got back to my truck, drove home, sat down. And in that moment of walking in the door, I was like there was this kind of decompression. And that's when the buffered experience of near death wanted to come out. So this is where I wanted to have an emotional release. And unfortunately, my romantic partner at the time, instead of giving me the space to process it out, they made it about them. They would like, what would have happened to me if you died? And it's like, what? Right. So there was this inability to hold space, right? And that's a classic thing that I witness with parents. Like when our child goes through something, we want to hold the space for them. We don't make it about us. And that was something I'd grown up with, which was when I had a big experience, it wasn't about me anymore. It was about the inconvenience I was causing my mother. And so, unfortunately, that was my childhood experience, which was really tough. And it's the reason that I ended up in this work. That's the deeper reason. But ultimately, I chose a romantic partner that had the same kind of signature of like, it was all about them. And so, I got home and it was all about them. And I never had the opportunity to go through the process of releasing. And I also didn't create that for myself, which is, my piece to look at, right? That's my own shadow. So now I'm much better at creating the space that I need to process out and to be with my own emotions. So ultimately that was my entry point. So I was then running in the background this incomplete reflex of being stuck in an avalanche. What that meant was I was continuously stressed. It was like I was always being chased by a tiger. And I didn't know how to turn that off. And I didn't even really know that it was going on. I was kind of just on edge. And so I found that the socially acceptable way to soften myself was through alcohol. So I started to drink. And I used alcohol to numb my pain, to numb the high tone that I was experiencing. And then, thankfully, after about 3 weeks, I was like, this isn't going to work. Long term, this isn't going to be the solution. So I went to see someone that specialized in trauma that I'd already worked a little bit with for a knee injury. And they supported me in actually going into and reliving that experience. And how that looked is I went to a treatment room and we started using movement to elicit the response. And then I actually relived the whole trauma response through movement, and it was like I was having a flashback. And I went into like this dissociative response, and I was sweating and I was pulsating and I was shaking in their treatment room. And they were comfortable in that. They were trained in that. And I had no idea what was going on. And that was a really profound experience for me. It was kind of like what came over me. Like there was something that took over me, and I went into this convulsive state, and then I came out the end. And what I noticed when I came out is I felt a lot more relaxed. I was a lot more comfortable in my body. I could feel myself again, and my peripheral vision had widened. And so the way that I experienced the world had changed from that one session. And it was profound. And unfortunately, it opened up into all of the other incomplete reflexes and emotions that I'd stored for ultimately the first 30 years of my life. So unfortunately, I spent 2 years unpacking that, which was, some would label that as a spiritual awakening, but ultimately it was a nervous breakdown. And I think, that the whole spiritual awakening thing is like a really nice way to label what I went through. But ultimately, like I was, a fucking mess. And I went into, I went deeper into alcoholism. I went into depression. I had anxiety. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't really have the resources at the time or the people to support me in that, and I didn't know or understand what was going on. And we're going back 10 years here. The work of Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine was not really very widespread. People didn't really understand PTSD or trauma in the same way that I think we do now. I think now it's kind of spun onto the other end of the spectrum where everyone talks about it, but still there's very few practitioners that can actually regulate a nervous system, which is I hope the pendulum will swing back into like more deeper understanding of it. But ultimately what happened for me is I found breathwork. And when I found breathwork, I understood polyvagal theory, I understood the work of Levine. I'd been studying trauma for a couple of years at that point. I was still very fresh in my own experience. And when I found breathwork, I understood that this was the gateway for me. And I spent a year practicing deep practice and training, and then subsequent training and embodiment. And then I found that there was more that was missing. There was work that was missing with the work of Levine. The breathwork that I was studying was incomplete. I started studying more embodiment practices. I trained in yoga. I got a YTT. I started studying Chinese medicine, Chinese massage and manipulation. And I started to bring all of this together with Canadian traditions of sweat lodge ceremony and the indigenous healing. Then I went into this whole mystical journey of exploring psychedelics. And then, I realized that for me, the path was through connected breathing. So I kind of built all of these things together. And then, I came back. And then, through that, my own lived experience, I realized that I had amassed a variety of different skills to figure out my own shit. And then it was just anecdotal at this point. It was like, it had worked for me, but did it work for anyone else? And there was a curiosity about that. And so at that point, I spent a couple of years in clinic just working with clients, just exploring. And then, it was, about a year and a half ago, I decided that it was time to gently start exploring if other people could also do this work. And that was when we started to train here with our technique that we have, what's called FBR, which is facilitated breath repatterning. And I very hesitantly started to work with people, with training people. And then, trainings got really popular. We've got about 50 applicants for a year. We only trained 12 practitioners. This year, we just trained our 12 practitioners. We're now in mentorship with them. We have about 50 applicants. It's getting more. I think we've got about 60 this year for next year in March for 12 spots. So we're noticing, and it would be great. This is where it's interesting. Feasibly, we could run 4 trainings next year, but I just honor my capacity. And I just really want to train small groups of people really, really well. This is touch work. It's very deep work. It can't be trained online. It needs to be trained in person. We're taking people through these really deep reflexes, and it needs to be done with a lot of awareness and a lot of gentleness and a lot of sensitivity. And for me, that's only in person over an extended period of time. And that's what I'm really loving now. It's super fun.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so essentially breathwork helped you overcome your PTSD.
Yeah.
Which is, that's life-changing, right? That's huge.
Yeah, and for me, one of the greatest joys has been applying that to others. Like in a variety of different ways. Like some of the most profound work I do has been with women after giving birth. And I think in our culture and society, birthing is really overlooked. Women are expected to exit from hospital in 3 days. And that's in a Western medical system. And if they're birthing at home, which is so courageous and amazing, and at the same time deeply challenging in our culture and society, the level of support that women receive, culturally is so low. And I think it ought to be really celebrated and honored as a massive process. And so, what I've witnessed both in the birth of my own son and in supporting other women going through that process is that the reflexes that come through in birthing, they need to be completed. And the breath moving into the pelvis, which we've touched upon, breath really stops moving into the pelvis oftentimes after cesarean, after a spinal, after an epidural. And so it's important that that area is repatterned through breath and movement with the nervous system. Some of the most meaningful work has been with mothers after they've given birth, has been repatterning the hips and the pelvis, has been bringing breath back into that space. It's been creating the deeper sense of groundedness and a vibrancy in their own being at the very time that they're about to educate a human on how to regulate their own nervous system. I wonder what would have happened if my mother had the support of someone that was trained in this work when I was born. I think about the level of ultimately challenge that she faced, and then the cultural and systemic challenges it created for me and the trauma that I went through in my childhood, and then how that compounded in my life, and what the difference would be if women had access to quality practitioners who understood the nuances and subtleties of pelvic breathing, how it would impact them as mothers. And so, yeah, I think that's, you know, that's some of the greatest joy, is witnessing and supporting parents, and of course fathers as well. You know, I think about my own capacity to find greater patience with my son has been such a great journey. In those moments where he asks me why for the 50th time in the morning. Why, Daddy? I'm like, well, let's go on a story. The water, you know, I tell him this story about the flow of water, and he loves hearing the story. And I love telling him this story about how when he drinks the water, where it goes, how it goes through his body, and it goes into the toilet, it goes down into the subac, and it goes down into the river, and it flows out into the sea, and it turns into a cloud. Anyway, I have 15 different stories of how I tell him about the flow of water. And he loves it. And so it's given me this capacity to find all of this patience with my son. And I wonder what would happen if, you know, as parents, if we had the time to really be with our children. And I think about those parts of me that would have longed to connected more deeply with my father. So I suppose, yeah, breathwork's given me this gift of healing myself and those parts of me that had, yeah, single event trauma in PTSD, these big avalanche experience as an example, but also all of these patterns of behavior from my childhood, all of these adaptions that I had, and learning how to more deeply touch into those. And I suppose I made the decision that it stops with me. I'm not passing this on to my son. And that requires me to continue to practice my own breath rhythms, to live in greater harmony with myself and with the support that I have around me, and to support him in his growth and to show up for him in a different way.
Mm. Yeah, that's what you touched on there. You touched on a few things. So the female aspect, supporting mothers.
Yeah.
So you said if your mum could have had this support back then, things would have been different. Yeah. In what way do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I'm mindful to respect her, you know, like our relationship's challenged. And I can't really speak too much to her experience, but I know from my experience, I think about how isolated she was and how, you know, she's told me a little bit about her story and how she gave birth to me. And then how, you know, she had a male doctor who didn't really respect or understand her. We're going back, this is 1981 in the UK is where I was born. And I think about, you know, her, and she didn't have support. She didn't have a big network of people around her. She wasn't really respected as a woman. It wasn't considered to be a sacred act. And the wisdom of how she could have given birth wasn't really honored. And then outside of that, you know, like, you know, it was a traumatic experience for her. And, you know, the way that she was then supported and the way that she healed and the way that breath moved through her, I don't think she was really given what she really needed. And I think the impacts of that have been probably quite long term. And yeah, who really knows? I mean, you know, that's her experience, and you know, we'd have to get her on the podcast to speak to her about that. But I think for women in general in that time in the 80s, it was probably quite challenging in general to give birth, and I think some women were supported. So again, it's complex and it's nuanced. But ultimately, yeah, my childhood experience was challenging. And I think it was also tough for my father in the way that he showed up and the way that he would have wanted to show up. So there's a lot there, you know. It's taken a lot of time for me to reflect on that and for me to get clear on that. It's taken a lot of personal therapy as well for me to understand my childhood and the way that I've behaved and showed up as well. And how ultimately I entered into a role as caregiving my mother as opposed to really like her caregiving me a lot of the time. Yeah. And that, you know, for a lot of men who have grown up with mothers without a father present, we have a tendency to caregive. And that's one of the patterns of behavior that shows up. And it can be quite toxic. And it's showed up in romantic relationship where I've had to really check myself. And I'm not helping my partner by over caregiving them. You know, I'm enabling poor behavior. So I've had to really be quite humble and look at my own patterns and really check in with myself and be like, I'm not supporting anyone by doing this.
Big realization. I've had similar issues with my own self, my own past. Yeah, I think what the word is, the codependency.
Yeah.
The codependency, yeah.
Yeah, and it's feeding into like, you know, ultimately like narcissism, right? And that's where I had to really look at myself and see those parts of me where I was narcissistic, where I was like, I was attempting to manage someone else's emotional experience as opposed to just sitting with them in their discomfort. Right. What I love about breathwork, It comes back to our earlier comment. I have found beauty in sitting with people in their discomfort, you know? And instead of wanting to change it or care give someone, I'm just comfortable. And it's been such a gift for me. And how that's relayed is I'm comfortable sitting with my son in his discomfort. I'm comfortable being with him and holding him and nurturing him. I don't need to change his experience. I don't need to distract him. I don't need to tell him to stop crying. I just let him cry.
Yeah, I'd add to that. That was actually, because I was quite, I think that was actually one of the first times I've cried in front of a man.
Yeah.
With our session.
Yeah, thank you, bro.
And I just felt, sounds weird to say this, but I felt so safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did. You weren't judging me crying. You're actually encouraging me to let the emotions out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those biggest things, right? Because in this, we talk about, there's some narratives out there around patriarch and matriarch, right? Yeah. And everyone says we live in this patriarch society. Everyone, let me rephrase that. A lot of women say we live in a patriarch society. A lot of men say we live in a matriarch society, right? And a lot of men say we live in a patriarch society. Either way, one only exists with the other. And this is the ultimate lens of codependency. Men hardening and not expressing emotion is the same side of the other coin of women flooding and being emotionally unavailable to support men in their softness. So we've created this pattern, which you touch into, of codependency, right? And ultimately it's a spiral that comes down in multi-generational trauma. And it's tricky. And so men being shamed for expressing their tears by both men and women creates a hardening. And it creates this fear or shame around vulnerability. And so, it lights me up to hear that you were willing to cry in our session, and holding men in their tears as a man is something very profound. I have, of course, had countless of the same experiences where in my training and with my team now, my team has held me in my greatest pain. They've watched me cry. It starts to bring emotion up for me in that my business partner and a lot of my senior team, they've watched me in deep sadness, in grief, in my anger, in my rage, and they've held me in it. And there is this quality that they've somehow loved me in it. And this is what I wish for my son, is that I love him in his anger, and I love him in his rage, and I love him in his sadness and his tears. And this is ultimately what I teach as a breathwork practitioner. The greatest gift is love. And that's really nice, but what it actually means is this acceptance of you in all states. And we circle back to the Jungian psychological piece. You are all things. You are sometimes angry, and you are sometimes deeply, deeply sad. And if I can acknowledge all of those parts of you and hold you in those, I allow you to bring back those parts of you that you might have exiled from your childhood, and I allow you to live a much more whole and complete life. And in doing that, I allow it in myself. Yeah. So I get this gift of watching these people and accepting and loving them in that. And it's just this huge mirror. How can I be with my own anger and my own grief and my own rage and all of those pieces? Yeah,
it's like my friend Emil says. He's an emotional intelligence coach. You know Emil.
Yeah, I know Emil.
And he said, the deeper you go yourself, the better you are able to support others. And that's literally it. Because if you didn't go deep with yourself first, to be okay with all these emotions that most people have shame around, you would not be able to support people when they're angry or they're in grief or they're really sad.
Yeah, thank you. I attract clients who are in deep stages. They have a trust. The depth that I went to 9 years ago was that I almost took my life. And I was 2 seconds away from throwing myself in front of a bus. Wow. And it's not something that I often speak about. And I've become more vocal recently because I'm in a space of deep steadiness in my own being, both mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I feel confident in sharing this now. And I remember that moment as the lowest point of my life. Actually, the lowest point was probably 2 hours later, where I was just crying. I was curled up in a ball crying, my eyes out. And I cried for 5 hours after that. It was this deep, deep sense of how the fuck did I get here? And it took some time to recover. And then my recovery, I think the reason I'm willing to speak to it at a deeper level now is because I have this knowing that what I live and what I teach works. Not just for me, but for my team and for the now thousands of people we've served. And I suppose now with research, and as we start moving into that, we're actually starting to get a lot clearer on why it works. Because I was like, oh, this works, it's amazing. And I was like, why? I don't know. And now we've started to understand why a lot deeper. So yeah, for me, that low point was the biggest turning point of my life. And there's a trust with my clients that they know that I've been there, and that I'm here now. And so they somehow believe in me. And it's that belief in me and in my story and in my challenge and my struggles that empowers them to work with me, or to at least work with one of the team. And I have a lot of respect for anyone that shows up and is willing to unpack the depth of our own pain and the depth of our own misery that is creating endless suffering in our lives. And when we touch into it, we can create a lot more clarity and a lot more freedom.
Mm. Well, thank you for sharing that. That was very vulnerable. Yeah. I know I don't want to go too deep into that, but I just want to touch on something because I've had friends who have been close to taking their life, and I'm just genuinely curious, and maybe there's people listening who are maybe in that kind of state. So when you were 2 seconds away, what was that thought that made you decide to live again?
Yeah, there was something deeper. I mean, this is all I can speak to. There was something deeper that moved through me.
Okay.
And really what happened was there was this knowing that was like, there's another way. And I knew it was not my time. And with that, I gave myself an ultimatum. And I gave myself 2 years. And I said, I will put everything I have for 2 years into understanding how I got here and why. And I made a pact with myself. I said, in 2 years, if I'm still there, I'll do it. And 2 years later, I had a lot of reasons to live.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And so breathwork it's not just about breathing for you. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah, so much deeper.
It's life. It's literally giving you life, giving you purpose.
Yeah, my mission is to alleviate suffering, because like the pain of life is unavoidable, right? But the suffering is optional.
Yep.
And that's the meaning that we make about the pain. And it's how quickly we integrate our experiences and we make meaning out of it and we move forward. That's not a cognitive process. It's an embodied experience. My son is probably the greatest motivator in my life. He's just a clear mirror, and he's an amazing soul, and I love him so much. And he gives me this motivation in so many different ways. And I have a lot of love and respect for his mother, and the way that she's shown up for him as well is just profound. And we've been through a lot of challenge in the last few years, and we're continuing to understand each other more deeply, and the patterns that we carry and how we trigger the shit out of each other, and how we understand each other, repeatedly and more. And that's been a really big process. But ultimately, he motivates me. And I just I was resistant to have children for a long time. And I think, as I look at my own journey, there was this, I was unwilling to bring a child into the world because of the way that I saw it. And as I started to see the world through different lenses, and as I started to understand the human experience and just this joy that's possible, I kind of thought, actually, this is now a world I would like to bring a child into. And what I'm continuing to do is to ask myself, and it comes back to the intention, what is the world I would like him to live in? And I think, a lot of these ways of like looking forward 7 generations, what is the world that I would like to see for his grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren? How would I like to see the world evolve? And we face a lot of challenges as humanity, let's not sugarcoat it, but generally the world is getting better. It's, Hans Rosling kind of speaks to this in his book Factfulness. When we look at the world, life expectancy is increasing, more people are better educated, people are better fed, the poverty level's decreasing, people are getting wealthier, wealth distribution is getting better statistically. These are World Health Organization facts, right? When we start to look at that, actually the world is becoming a much more enjoyable and safer place to live, and I would like to continue to see that. So yeah, he gives me a lot of hope, and I would much rather to live with reality and hope than avoidance or spiritual bypassing or emotional bypassing, and just this, hopefulness that's just grounded in nothing, So I have meaningful projects, and I want to see a legacy for my son and for his children as well, if he chooses to have them.
Yeah, that's amazing, and that's powerful that you shared that, because I think there's a lot of people that are maybe on the fence of having a child, out of fear of bringing them into this world, as you spoke to.
Yeah. Yeah, that fear is real, and I think it's valuable.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really big decision. There's a responsibility that comes with it. You're bringing a human into the world, and it's my responsibility as his father to raise him and to spend meaningful time with him and support him and provide for him emotionally. And that takes a lot of time. But that means I need to be financially in a position to be able to give him that. And, I made a decision to only have one child because I don't have the capacity. Humbly, I need to admit that. I couldn't raise two children. No way. And I think, we really need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves that question in a deep way. Do I have the capacity to raise a human? And it's a big ask. And I'm really happy to do more father work and men's work. That's starting to come alive more here in Bali. And yeah, it's good to see men stepping into that role and understand what it means to actually be a father. And I think, again, it takes this kind of reclamation of our own childhood. We need to really reconcile our relationship to our own father. And that's been a beautiful journey for me as well.
Yeah. And it's powerful because your son is going to be supported in all of his emotions.
Yes.
So he's not going to have shame around any emotion.
That would be my prayer. Yeah.
Yes.
And that would be amazing. And also in the times where I don't get it right, I have the humility to admit that I've made an error, and how can we repair? And I think parenting isn't about being perfect consistently, because that's also, an illusion. It's about doing the best that I can all the time, and knowing those times I don't get it right, saying I'm sorry and being willing to learn. He tells me, he's like, he tells me when I've made a mistake, and I need to put my hand up and admit that and learn from him. And he's been such an amazing teacher. And again, I didn't have that opportunity with my parents to be like, hey, this doesn't work for me. Like, they weren't listening. They were like, we tell you what to do. Now, my parenting style is co-creation, and, his mother is the same. And I love that. I think that's really powerful. And there's so much, parenting's a two-way street. I've learned so much from him, and that's just been such a gift.
That's beautiful. So is there any closing remarks you want to share with people? Usually I end, I'll ask you that, and then I'll ask you another question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think coming back to that question, how am I breathing? Like, let's ask ourselves that. How am I breathing? And let's do that moment to moment. I've been aware of my breath during this interview here, and it's been, on times vibrant, and it's changed with some of the emotional stories I've shared, and on times I've had these big inhales and then big exhales just as I kind of relax myself. And yeah, ask that first question, how am I breathing? I think that is the entry point to discovering the secrets of this human experience and to getting into more understanding of the universe.
Powerful. How am I breathing?
Yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I think about that as you're talking, and on other podcasts I'm always thinking, how am I breathing right now? Am I breathing too shallow? Or?
Yeah. Is it all right? Yeah. And again, it comes back to this trust. Like, we've got to trust the system, right? And then at the same time, there's a curiosity with that. When we're in curiosity with inquiry, it's like this compassionate inquiry that starts to come alive. And that for me is this basis of deeper humility and understanding of myself. There's a softness to that, right?
Yes.
And I think it's in that softening into ourselves that we actually allow the emergence for more understanding and more connection to all parts of us.
And that's really what it's about, right? Like connecting more to ourselves.
Yeah, more deeply to ourselves and each other. I mean, you shared with your willingness to cry in our first session. I love that, and that's meaningful. And there's something about that as an experience for you and for me. When I continue to show up in life and have these deeper connections, my life's so much richer. It's fuller. It is more meaningful. And I think that's really what I crave, what I long for. I think it's what all of us long for, ultimately.
Yeah, so that actually leads nicely into my next question, which is, I ask every single guest this, by the way. Yeah. I think I'm going to do a compilation because everyone has a different answer. So what is the meaning of life in your own words?
Well, thank you. I suppose for me, it's about relationships. And that is with all things. How am I in relationship to the air I'm breathing? To the story of the water that I tell my son, to the way that I move in my hips and my pelvis, to the food that I eat in cycles, to you, to fellow men, to women, to mothers, to children. How am I in relationship to all things? And that is this continued exploration and learning. And I think it is that curiosity to explore those relationships. And that's kind of my interpretation. It comes, I think, from two sort of people that I've enjoyed exploring their lenses of the world. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. We make meaning out of meaning. And that relates into Mark Manson, which is like the meaning of life is meaning. And so it's like, so he kind of relates to that as well. The meaning of life is to find meaning. And so the meaning of life is meaning. So then it's the meaning of life is meaning. So life is life and meaning is meaning and meaning is life and life is meaning. So I don't really answer that question at all in that. But I think I do in relationship, in explaining like how do we relate.
That's powerful. Thank you. It's a very refreshing perspective. Again, like I said, everyone's got a different perspective and answer.
I want to see the real. I want to see the real.
I'm going to collate it.
So bring that.
Because, but to that question, it's like what you just said, right? Because meaning is what you make. The meaning of life is what you make it mean for yourself.
Yeah.
So in that statement, everyone will have a different meaning.
Yes.
Because everyone's different.
And I think there's a beauty in exploring that individually and collectively as opposed to taking something externally. And it's kind of very like Taoist in that sense. It's like the meaning is what it is for us in each moment based on our own previous experiences and how we've lived.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Edward, for sharing.
Thank you, bro.
Great. Couple of hours.
What a conversation.
Really good. Where can people find out more about you if they're curious about breathwork, all things Edward Dangerfield? All
things Edward Dangerfield. I mean, I have a very rudimentary website that's likely to unfold a little bit in the next couple of years when I focus more time on that. But I mean, it's quite useless. It's just edwarddangerfield.com. There's more on my Instagram, the wonderful /dreaded Instagram. Edward, it's just at Edward Dangerfield.
Yep.
I'm going to start more long format. I'm going to move into more writing.
Awesome.
I've got more spaciousness to do that in the next little while here. So those are sort of the places to connect with me. And then to connect with the team is through Breathwork Bali.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So if you're ever in Bali, come and hit up Edward and the Breathwork Bali team. I highly recommend them. And Edward, this has been a great chat and I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, bro. Loved our time together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys in the next one.